So my name is Maija Renko, and Kate Caldwell and I are going to be talking to you about our research on entrepreneurship and disability for the next however long this is going to take. We shall see. I was going to share a set of slides, and it looks like I'm able to do that. So here we go. Someone give me a nod if you can see the slides. Can you see the slides? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So Kate and I have been working on this topic of entrepreneurship and disability. When I was actually preparing this presentation, I was thinking back to how long have we been doing this? And I think since about 2010, which
since 2010.
So it was just yesterday that we started, right? I'm gonna first start off by talking a little bit about the topic and how we approach it in general, and I have some slides that are specific to a couple of studies we published, and then Kate will take over and talk about her approach and a method that she has been using in her dissertation, and I believe afterwards too, dyadic interviewing, which I think is a really interesting and exciting method, and something that I haven't seen in the field of business and management used before. So both of us have our personal websites. I listed them here, so if you want to know more about our backgrounds and the papers and whatever else we put there, feel free to visit the websites. And obviously, if you have any questions afterwards, after our session is over and whatnot, feel free to contact us. I think, at least for my part, and maybe also Kate's part, I'm putting words in her mouth now, but we're happy to take questions as they come up during the presentation. But then obviously you can also save them to the end if you like. I don't see the chat, so if you have a question, maybe raise your virtual hand if you can, and if not, just voice your question as it comes up. So we're going to be talking about entrepreneurship for people with disabilities, and how and why do people with disabilities engage in entrepreneurship? So those are really big questions that have been kind of guiding our research in this domain. And the two perspectives that I think you will see coming through in what we're saying here are this idea that there is certainly dignity of work, and it's something that is an underlying value that you see in a lot of in all of our research, really. And then the other perspective that you will see coming through is that we talk quite a bit about barriers to entrepreneurship. And when we talk about these barriers, we very much adopt a view of disability as a societal issue. We shy away from thinking of disability as a characteristic of an individual, but rather we focus on the societal responses to people who are different. And I think social model of disability is the one that they use in disability studies that our research aligns with. I should have said, and Kate will do a better job of introducing herself when she starts, but so Kate is at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm at DePaul University. When we started to work together, we were both at UIC, and Kate is affiliated with the Department of Disability and Human Development over there in the College of Applied Health Sciences, I believe, and I'm in the business school. And for me, all of my research pretty much has to do with entrepreneurship, different aspects, different types of entrepreneurs, the process of starting up a business, motivations, all of that. Whereas Kate's research, she'll talk more about it, but yeah, it's focused squarely on disability and different aspects of that. So in terms of dignity of work, and I think these ideas and thoughts are so timely, especially today when we are hopefully coming out of the pandemic a little bit here. And, the past 2 years, things that have happened in the job market and in how people work and what kind of value people see in their work. I think these topics are really timely and important. But even before the pandemic, and ever since we started to work on this topic, I think we were including these ideas in our research questions, and they, like I said before, they were kind of values that were guiding our work. So obviously, work is important because it provides the means to provide for life. So we need work to be able to support ourselves, our families, our communities, and so forth. Work is also important because we can utilize our skills and capabilities in work. And this is obviously important for everyone, but just if we think about the term disability and kind of what it implies, I would say that this number 2 may be particularly important in this population because of being able to, like the term says, utilize those skills and capabilities that the person has, and then feel the self-realization that follows from that. Knowledge and skill development through work is obviously really important. We know that by having work and having experience, we further improve our knowledge and skill base. And needless to say, particularly important in today's world, where knowledge types of jobs, where technology and knowledge are really in the center of the job, are so central and important. And then the fourth point, and this by no means in order of importance, social engagement with others, it's hugely important. So when we can work with others and learn from others, that in itself has an important value. So with that, I wanted to also bring up this definition of disability. And I think probably for this group, since you're all familiar with the field, this may not be as important, but you'd be surprised, especially in the business and management world, and even among reviewers of your papers, how common it is that people don't really have an understanding of what disability is. We've gotten all kinds of reviewer comments about this, like, I've been sick for a long time. Do I have a disability? And so here's the definition from United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that is widely used, and it tells you what disability is. So in our work, when we've studied people with disabilities, when we've collected primary data and so forth, we've included all kinds of disabilities, but you will hear when Kate talks about her research and her dissertation research more specifically, she focused on individuals with intellectual disabilities. So if we look at the whole wide range of disability and how prevalent it is, about 10%, I believe, of the population has a disability. So it's certainly something that is important to account for in any area of research that includes human subjects. But especially in something like entrepreneurship, where we're talking about societal issues and barriers and context that feeds into our starting of businesses and so forth. So very high level view of entrepreneurship and people with disabilities and how you see this topic studied in management, in business. So there's research and obviously there's related empirical phenomena where the business model that includes people with disabilities is kind of this social enterprise model oftentimes that is depicted on the left-hand side of this figure. So here we are talking about businesses and organizations that are started by, oftentimes it can be the supporters and parents of those who have disabilities. or it can be nonprofits that start, social enterprise arms that help people with disabilities. And the idea here is that you employ people with disabilities in your organization, and that is how you integrate them into business. What we see oftentimes, and I know Kate may be talking about this a little more, but what we see oftentimes in these cases is that the target population here, people with disabilities, they are not always, or I would even venture to say that they are seldom integrated into the actual decision making of the business, and they are sometimes even not paid according to minimum wage standards. There's all kinds of issues here in the U.S. in the labor market that allow practices that are far from including the opinions and experiences of people with disabilities in the decision making of these kinds of organizations. What we have studied and where our research focus has been more is on the right-hand side of this figure, which is entrepreneurship by people with disabilities. So individuals who identify as people with as a person with disability, when they go into business, that's the process that our research has focused on. Employment rate of people with disabilities in the U.S. is about half, if not even that, right now after the pandemic, of the general population. I see Kate shaking her head, so it's probably even worse than that, right? And then, however, when we look at self-employment, we see that people with disabilities are about twice as commonly represented as the general population. So around 11% is the self-employment rate among working age adults in the United States. So that's kind of a context for our study and our studies. And again, this is specific to the United States for now, but I know you're all from all over the world, so I think hopefully you can kind of take some of these things that we're talking about here with contextual, like institutional background in mind. I said we're not really studying that topic of employment or entrepreneurship for people with disabilities, the social enterprise models that where businesses are started by those who don't have a disability. But there are, of course, good examples of these kinds of organizations as well. And one of the big ones that here in Chicago everybody knows about is Spiritech, which is an interesting example in that the company really designed its business model and the services and everything they sell so that they align with the abilities of the individuals who work there. So it's not a business where you have paper shredding or something that is not meaningful for those who do the work, but it's something that really capitalizes on the skills of people with autism who work at the business. But then moving on to this entrepreneurship by people with disabilities, and where our focus has been. In the following slides, I've got material from basically two sources of data. So when we first started to work together, our first study was really on social entrepreneurship among and by people with disabilities. So again, people with disabilities going into entrepreneurship themselves. We did focus groups with people who had started businesses or had tried to start businesses and were in the process of doing that. And then we also interviewed supporters and stakeholders in the field of disability and employment to kind of round up the data. So I have some excerpts from those interviews here, but then for the quantitative data, a couple of years ago, and time flies, I guess it's been a while since we did this study too, but we took a look at the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics, which is a data set that I had been familiar with for a long time, and just tried to explore a little bit of what's going on there in terms of disability. Well, it turns out that this data set, as well as many of the others in business, when they ask the respondent about disability, the measures tend to be very not very detailed. So, but they do have a question in this data that asks whether the respondent has a disability or not. So the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics, for those of you who don't know, it's a study that follows individuals over 5 or 6 year period of time. And the individuals who are in the data set are first identified based on the fact that they report as being someone who is in the process of starting a business. So it's not a data set of companies, it's a data set of individuals in the United States who say that they are starting a business. And then they are followed up year after year, like I said, up to 6 years or 5 years. So, and I believe you also probably got the paper that we published out of this, the PSAD study. So this really led us to, or in this study, we took a careful look at those different barriers to entrepreneurship that people with disabilities face and how they had reflected, in the data set. So what we saw as we followed up these individuals over time, we saw that those who did have disabilities, and again, it's a crude measure of yes or no, they reported that they were less likely to actually launch the business that they were trying to start than what were those who did not have disabilities. But even more importantly, I think the data set showed that those barriers that have been identified in the largest, in society in general, they were very much present in this entrepreneurship data set as well. So we saw, looking at the what in business we would call human capital variables, so industry experience, startup experience, education, we see that there's differences there. We saw differences in the social networks of entrepreneurs with disabilities, and then the startup investment that between these two groups was also different on average. So in terms of industry experience, we know that since people with disabilities face barriers to employment in the open job market, it's not surprising that those who have a disability, they actually tend to stay longer in the industry where they are employed. So their industry experience is actually significantly higher in years than those who don't have disabilities. Startup experience, like I said before, people with disabilities in the United States are more likely to be self-employed entrepreneurs. So there is a slight difference in that direction in this data as well. Education levels tend to be lower for people with disabilities. And then in terms of the really important social networks that entrepreneurs derive their resources from, I think it's really important to note that people with disabilities come from smaller households on average. And if we look at, the importance of your very core supporters, your household members, your family, your immediate strong connections in the startup process, we know that that's so important at the earliest stages. So the fact that the household size is smaller is a reflection of one of the barriers that we see. Also, we see that the startup team size was smaller for those who had disabilities, not surprisingly, based on what I just said, right? The most common startup team in the United States is a husband and wife team, and oftentimes families come together to build businesses. Helpers, key non-owners, there were no significant differences there, but I will say that in this data set, those were some of the variables that were not as carefully reported probably as some of the other variables. When it comes to the total startup investment that the team itself puts into the startup, again, we see that those who have a disability, those investments tend to be smaller on average. So these were discussed in the article you had access to, and these are some of the key barriers that people with disabilities deal with when they start businesses. And now it is kind of a paradox, right? Like on one hand, they deal with significant barriers, but on the other hand, I just said that self-employment entrepreneurship rate is higher among this population. So they do go into business, they do start businesses. So despite the barriers, they do engage in entrepreneurship. So importantly, we have to remember that these barriers are present both in the startup world as well as in the job market, right? So in the stories that we heard in the more qualitative interviews, there were a lot of stories of why they had to leave the job market, the jobs that they had before. One of the things that we don't have data on in these data sets is how long the person in question has had the disability. The PSED does not report on that, but in our qualitative interviews, that was something that very much came or was an important factor that people discussed. So whether the disability was acquired later in life and kind of where in the course of life the person was, that was something that was directly reflected in how they approached then work and career afterwards. So here are some quotes from those interviews from individuals like you see here in the middle. Someone with multiple sclerosis left the position as statewide director for community outreach and programming for a large organization when they were unable to drive, and then they just had to come up with something else to do. So that was a pretty common story we heard. So in some ways you could say that people with disabilities are sometimes pushed to entrepreneurship, and I believe this is something that Kate will talk more about as well. So, but it's, even if there are these push factors and barriers, it's obviously not all doom and darkness. There's also, importantly, these businesses that get started by people with disabilities that really serve important market needs that where there's a real opportunity in the marketplace that the entrepreneurs choose to cater for, and the unique experiences of people with disabilities factor into these kinds of businesses that they start. So here's a quote from one of our entrepreneurs saying, the idea for my business was based on my disability. When I was working in the United Kingdom, I had a hard time working over the phone, and my associates didn't have cell phones. I needed to start using computer software to monitor and operate this process, and we decided to form a company based around that pattern. So lots of stories like this. I think in entrepreneurship that the term user innovation maybe comes close to what we see a lot here. So people start businesses based on their own experiences and their own needs that need to be filled. So people start businesses even if the barriers are there. One contextual factor that we've observed and something that has a lot of policy implications is depicted here in this graph. So it is both sad and kind of interesting that, despite these trends that I've talked about, despite people with disabilities getting into entrepreneurship at higher rates than the general population and so forth, when you look at the support for entrepreneurship that is provided by different kinds of organizations that support employment for people with disabilities, it's still kind of marginal. So there is this perception to some extent in the community that, self-employment and entrepreneurship is the last option. Like if you can't find any other type of work as a person with disability, well, maybe you go and start your own business. That's, as we all know, it's a very kind of old-fashioned way of thinking and does not align with the realities of a lot of the people that we see starting businesses, but it is something that is impacting the supports that are, or rather are not available to the extent that they would need to be. On that thought of like, how is self-employment and entrepreneurship perceived in the community of disability and those who support or are supposed to support entrepreneurs with disabilities. I think it's interesting that just the wording of how we talk about this phenomenon seems to have a pretty significant impact in how people perceive what it is all about. So here's just some direct statistics from Illinois Vocational Rehabilitation Customer Survey from a couple of years ago. So when the customers of VR were asked about self-employment, do you need, self-employment services? Only 18% said that, yes, I need self-employment services. But when you ask them the question, do you need help starting a business based on your individual strengths and needs? You see that, wow, 72% say yes. So it's really a lot of it is about the framing of how we talk about things, and we've also seen this come through very strongly in our interactions with the research participants that we've had. And depending on their background, they may have very strong perceived notions of what self-employment can be or should be, or entrepreneurship can be or should be, and those attitudes are sometimes slow to change. So I'm going to finish my part here with giving you a couple of ideas from the more qualitative research that we did, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kate. So this analysis where we looked at, how did the entrepreneurs in the qualitative data set, how did they talk about their well-being that was related to the process of starting a business. These results actually have only been in a conference paper, so this is not a published paper, but I thought given the prevalence of well-being research in entrepreneurship right now, I thought this might be something interesting to think about. So I know this slide is kind of hard to see, but I'm going to take it one by one. So when we look at the kinds of themes that we could see in the data and how entrepreneurs with disabilities were reflecting their well-being, we see that one theme that comes through is related strongly to this idea of material well-being, right? So certainly there is an important element of economic status and money and being able to provide financially for your family. So people talked about being gainfully employed as being a way for them to make the money they need. And importantly, also the bigger quote here is a quote from somebody's mom who, if I remember right, this person herself was nonverbal, but this was something that their mom said, and reflects a lot of those family concerns that we saw as well. So this family had helped this woman to start a business, so that thinking forward, like what happens after mom and dad are not there anymore to provide, that the woman would have means to make money. So it's not only about the person with a disability themselves. There's a strong element of the support network that comes into this. User innovation and creating something that serves one's own needs. Like I said before, that was another theme that was directly related to this idea of material well-being. Then there was this theme of, they talked about well-being as self-realization and how this business startup was related to that. So I think it was very interesting to me to see how some of the entrepreneurs we spoke to, they used terminology such as that this business helped me come out of my disability closet. Like, they used the business that they started as a way to open up and it was very much related to their identity as a person with a disability and how they chose to communicate about that identity. And then obviously, going back to what I said earlier, these businesses were seen as ways for entrepreneurs to pursue interests that they had themselves. So not being employed in that paper shredding business, but creating something that was aligned with your own passions and interests. And then the third theme, which I'm not sure I would I'm not sure if it falls under the well-being category really, because the term resilience is so widely used now, and depending on who's talking about it, it can be categorized as a lot of different things. But I think in the data here, this idea that you're able to grow from adversity and from failure even, it was something that was strongly present. And I do think it links to the well-being in that, it's one of the ways in which people move forward and are able to take those setbacks from the employment market and then move on to start their own businesses. The quote here on the left, the long quote, is actually is from someone who is blind and started their own restaurant and had gone through a very adverse process of, first of all, getting educated as a chef. She had been blind since, I believe, 1 year old, so basically almost since birth, and had gone through training to be a chef. And there were obviously a lot of people who, as a part of that education, didn't think she should have been in that school. How can you handle a knife? How do you know where's hot, where's cold, and whatnot? But she was able to get through it, and in her stories there was such an underlying current of resilience in almost everything she said. So here she says, sometimes I feel frustrated because when I'm creating a dish or something, I would like to look at it to have the effect of the visual part, but I can't. That kind of frustrates me a bit. But then I think about it. So as I need to focus more on the flavor. So in that part, I get a little frustrated, but that can't stop me from going forward. So it's not been easy. It's a lot of fighting through all of my career and all of my life, pretty much. So I am going to leave it with that quote right there. And Kate will continue talking about the research that she has led. Kate, do you want to run your own slides, or do you want me to run them for you?
I'm fine either way. Why don't you?
I'm going to stop sharing, and if you have them ready, just.
I've got them right here.
Yeah.
Oh, I need to be. I'm disabled. Which is true. I do identify as a disabled person. But if I could have screen sharing enabled, that would be great.
I am so sorry, Kate. Coming right up. I should have picked up on that cue earlier.
That's fine. I enjoyed it. We could use this as a metaphor for the social model of disability.
We can fix the social model part. I take full blame and responsibility for it.
Totally fine. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
All right. One thing I will mention at the top before I get started is I do have a visual impairment. So if you do put something in the chat or raise your hand, I won't see it. So if somebody can just shout it out, that would be great. All right. So let's get started. Maija covered a lot of our intros already, but I'm just going to intro myself again. My name is Kate Caldwell. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I have a background in disability employment policy, as well as leadership, innovation, poverty policy, social policy writ large, I also am now getting heavily involved in post-secondary education for students with intellectual disabilities, and some other areas. My background is in disability studies, and you may or may not know that UIC has the first and still only PhD program in disability studies in the US, and that's where Sarah Parker Harris and I come from in the work that we do. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the research that we've done with social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities. And I've included a slide here with our core project team. We work with some other fantastic co-investigators as well, but I've included our core team, which is Sarah Parker Harris, Maija, of course, who has since defected to dePaul, so the tiny logo, and then myself, and we've got links here on the slide if you want to learn more about us, and also a link to where a lot of our work can be found. And I put a link in the chat earlier, which is at theseedproject.org, and I'll be referring to some resources that you can find on that website. And together, as part of this team, which as Maija mentioned, we've been working together since 2010. And in that time, we've conducted entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship research with adults with disabilities, with adults with intellectual disabilities, with transition-aged youth with disabilities. That includes intellectual and developmental disabilities. We've been very involved in policy analysis and using evidence-based research to inform policy recommendations at the federal, state, and local level. That's something that I'm particularly passionate about. And also from our research, we developed a comprehensive entrepreneurship education and training program. And the photo on the slide is actually a picture of the entrepreneurs with disabilities from that training that you can see here. We actually recently put our entire curriculum on our website at seedproject.org. So if you want to take a look, you're more than welcome to. We also have a link to our idea lab, because one of the things we found is that entrepreneurs with disabilities have difficulty figuring out if they want to pursue, making that entrepreneurial decision, right? Deciding if they want to pursue entrepreneurship. So we created the Idea Lab, which basically lets them know sort of what beginning stage they're at and whether they're ready to really start a business, and to help them make that decision for themselves. Of course, they can also work with service providers or family members to make that decision. And it sort of gives them some recommendations for things they can do to become more prepared, and some brainstorming activities, and of course, a business canvas to play around with. All right, so that's sort of an overview of all the work we've done. And today, of course, I'm going to be focusing on those social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities, because working with adults with intellectual disabilities is my area of expertise. And so we're going to start a brief agenda. We're going to start by going over the research questions. And then we're going to talk about a technique for conducting dyadic interviews, for doing in-depth interviews with adults with intellectual disabilities. And this is a technique that I did develop for my dissertation, and it's gained a lot of interest in the field, as well as with other disability populations. It pretty much applies to anyone for whom their competency, as loaded as a term that is, could be questioned. And we'll tuck into what that is, where it comes from, and how it works. And then finally, we'll go over some of the key findings of this research. So let's get started. The overarching research question for this research is looking at how people with intellectual disabilities are both participating and also supported in entrepreneurship. Coming from a disability studies perspective, we really value centering the person with a disability, right? Having their voice be at the center of this relationship. However, in disability studies, we also need to recognize this concept of what's called interdependence, which is recognizing that none of us live in a vacuum. We all actually rely upon other people in our everyday lives in order to live those lives to the fullest. So in order to be independent, we actually rely upon support from other people in various capacities. And the same is true for people with intellectual disabilities. So in order to be independent, we actually all rely upon interdependence. And for that reason, it's very important to look at not only how they're participating, but also how they're being supported, because that's what's going to actually make it feasible, right? And that's the context within which they're acting. So the sort of sub questions here broke down by looking at those three main entrepreneurial foci. First and foremost, their motivation or why they act. And I've also included links here or references rather, to where we've published these articles about this research, and you can actually find more information at any of these references. And if you wanted to email us, we'd be more than happy to shoot those articles your way. So please feel free to reach out. But we have published pretty much everything that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So first and foremost, we looked at motivation, or why they act. Then we also looked at management, those processes, or how they act. And then finally, we looked at the outcomes, what happens when they act. When you look at disability employment literature, it's primarily focused on outcomes. And a lot of times it doesn't look at the motivation or the management. And so it's really just looking at, what are we getting out of it? And so it's missing all of that stuff leading up to it. So there are a lot of implications from this research, even though it's focused on disability entrepreneurship, that's actually applicable to disability employment at large. All right, so these are our three main areas we're going to be looking at. Let's look at the interview technique we used. And I also included a reference on this slide because this has been published in the journal Qualitative Research if you want to learn more about this particular technique for dyadic interviewing. So dyadic interviewing basically comes from research on couplehood relationships, as well as Alzheimer's patients and things like that. But we're sort of looking at how we can use it to interview people with intellectual disabilities. And basically the dyad looks at, there's two individuals involved in the research, right? However, one of the biggest problems with intellectual disability research is proxy responding. And that's where someone else is speaking for the person with an intellectual disability, and you never actually hear from the person with an intellectual disability. And the interesting thing when you look at qualitative research, qualitative interview research in disability employment is it's pretty much all dyadic research. It's looking at two people, usually staff and family, or family members and the person with a disability. However, none of it has been structured as dyadic research, and instead ends up becoming proxy respondents. And so it ends up with the findings being said as though they came from the person with an intellectual disability, when in fact they did not. And so this technique actually addresses all of the limitations of interview research in particular with people with intellectual disabilities, while also providing several additional benefits. And it's a technique for dyadic interviewing that provides a structure for researchers to ensure that the focus is on the voice of the participant with ID, while valuing the support person as a source of information and contextualizing that information. So the unit of analysis is going to remain the person with ID as that primary data. It also recognizes that there's a need for accommodation in participating in research that promotes choice and self-determination, and one that does not hold people with intellectual disabilities, that I've been referring to as ID sometimes, intellectual disabilities or ID, to normative expectations regarding unrealistic ideals of quote unquote ability or quote unquote independence, right? So basically recognizing that it's not necessarily fair to say, oh yeah, I want you to participate in this interview, but I'm not going to give you any support to do so that you can give me, good responses, right? That are we don't want to say valid for qualitative research, but that are reflective of your experience, right? And they might need some support in order to give us good, rich data, right? But how can we do that in a way that's not going to lead it to proxy responding, right? Because I've done interviews in the past where, the parent invites themselves in, or I had one where a parent sat up with their back to the kitchen door and like cleared their voice every time they disagreed with what their family member said. It was like a right? So how do we actually address this? And dyadic interviewing provides a structure for doing so. It also, most importantly, values the support person as a source of supportive information instead of trying to control for it as though it doesn't exist. And this allows us to retain the focus on the individual with ID as the unit of analysis. So we're collecting data from the support person in dyadic interviewing, right? But that's being used as supportive, contextualizing information. And I'll show you how in just a second. Right. So let's see. So this is sort of the step-by-step breakdown of what the dyadic interviews look like. And it's got 3 stages, so it's a separate dyadic interviewing method, and I can show you the difference between those in a second. Stage 1 is your interview with the person with intellectual disability. And of course, the research starts before stage 1 because you have to get your foot in the door. And it's actually can be very challenging to negotiate with intermediaries in trying to, during the recruitment phase, because, the intellectual disability community have a long history of having people coming in to do research and assessments and diagnostics and all sorts of stuff. And so sometimes it can be difficult to get them to open up and be willing to participate in the research because they're used to people coming in, doing their thing, leaving, and then it being not the best experience. And so this approach to dyadic interviewing actually turns that all on its head. So the first step is stage 1, the interview with the person with intellectual disability. Here you're going to meet your participant and start to build trust and rapport with them. You're going to observe the environment that they're working in context. So where's their business located? Is it at a service provider organization? Is it in its own sort of workshop? Is it in their family home? Like, where are they doing this work and how are they doing this work? It allows you to gain a general understanding of the issue. So in this case, their social entrepreneurship. And also, this is the point where the person with intellectual disability is going to choose who they want their key support person to be. And the reason why that led me to this was I was struggling with trying to figure out how to do these interviews, and I wanted to respect social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities, just like I wanted to treat them just like we would treat any entrepreneur, with or without a disability. And so I was looking at a lot of the business research, and I noticed that sometimes businesses will choose representatives that will do the interviews on behalf of their organization. And I thought, that's interesting. What if we gave people with intellectual disabilities the opportunity to choose someone to help represent them? What would that look like? And how could that perhaps serve as a source of accommodation? And how can we structure this so that we can sort of prevent proxy responding from happening, right? So the most important part is that at the end of this first interview, that person with intellectual disability chooses who their key support person is going to be. Now, the person that I've been interacting with throughout recruitment always assumes they're going to be chosen as the key support person. And that's really what helps get the foot in the door, right? But it also shows that you're making an investment and that they're going to have a time to speak. That said, they are not always the person that is chosen by the participant with ID. And that's actually really interesting information in and of itself. We had one participant that, the mother had contacted me. She was a grad student. She was really interested in the methodology as well as the research that was being done. And she was pretty excited to participate. But then her son actually ended up choosing his father as the key support person, even though he did not spend much time working with him. But the time that he did spend working with him held a lot of value because he felt like it was really important to recognizing like his role as a growing young man, right? And so it led to some really interesting and important information that otherwise we wouldn't have gotten. So the other thing that's interesting is that I did not expect is that when they do identify their key support person, they become invested in helping make that relationship happen, and usually insisted on connecting me with their key support person, and whether it was by phone or by email, they wanted to make the introduction, right? And so it became clear at that point, I had become enmeshed, right, embedded in their business, in their lives in a way that normally you don't get with an interview. It's something more akin to something like ethnographic research, right? And so it really allowed me to have more of an insider view into what I was observing and asking about. So the second stage is the interview with the key support person. This allows you to meet that key support person and build rapport with them. It also allows you to observe that support relationship in context. So how do they work together? And then it provides data that's going to support and complement the initial interview. There's going to be items where there's similarities and discrepancies, and those similarities and discrepancies are really essential when you're doing the data analysis. It also allows you to identify topics or areas where you can ask probe questions. And one of the reasons why it provides a great accommodation is because in the first interview, the person with ID, if they're unsure of something, they can ask me to ask their key support person about it in the next interview. And that sort of takes a lot of pressure off of them, which reduces acquiescence and response bias, right? Because they don't feel like they need to give the right answer or remember something that they actually have difficulty remembering. They can ask me to check with their key support person. And then finally, I can use all of the information from this second interview with the key support person to inform my final interview. And that gets us to stage 3, where you go back and interview the person with intellectual disability again, right? So in the second interview with the key support person, it allows you to check a lot of the things you learned in the first interview and see where those similarities and discrepancies are. In the third interview, cross-checking between them. In the third interview, it allows you to member check and cross-check between that second and third interview and the first and third interview. So here you can update and verify information from previous interviews. It allows you to probe for rich information and gain a deeper understanding of how the person with ID participates and is supported. So it allows for comparisons, cross-checking, and triangulation of the data. Now, one of the things that you're going to get anytime you try to publish a paper with interviews with people with intellectual disabilities is reviewers are going to ask, was it rigorous? Is it reliable? How do they know? Do they know what they're talking about, right? And of course, we're talking about people who are just sharing their experiences and their perspectives, but we're going to get that pushback about how do they know about their own lives. And so one of the things that this does is it provides an additional level of rigor so that we can say, yes, they do know what they're talking about. They are sharing, valid, reliable, truthful experiences on their own lives in a way that remains focused on the person with an intellectual disability at the center and restricts the ability for proxy respondents and instead values supportive data as just that, contextualizing data. All right, so I know I threw a lot at you. It's really cool, it works really well. And again, it can be applied to any population for which one's quote unquote competency is questioned. So people with mental illness, things like that. All right, so in this research, we conducted in-depth, separate, semi-structured dyadic interviews using a robust field note strategy with 7 dyads. So 14 people overall, 7 pairs, basically. And this included people with intellectual disability. We had 4 social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities and the person they identified as their key support. However, in collecting this data, one thing that became very clear was that when I went to do the analysis, I didn't have anything to compare it to because I was really just working from scratch. And a lot of people said, you can't do research on social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities. You'll never find any. And I certainly did. But I had nothing to compare it to. And so what I did is I went out and recruited 3 more people who had intellectual disabilities and were working at a social enterprise, which we've given the pseudonym Budding Futures here. It's a greenhouse. So they were working at a social enterprise, but they were not social entrepreneurs themselves, right? They didn't own or run the social enterprise, but they were working there. And so that the goal of that was to provide, contextual information for the analysis. So I had something that I could compare to and, make sense of it. However, interestingly enough, when I started interviewing these individuals with ID, 2 of them were nascent entrepreneurs that were in the beginning stages of starting a bakery business. And one of them was considering starting his own self-employment business a couple of years down the road. So all of them were sort of in that nascent or considering entrepreneurship space, which actually provided a lot of really rich and interesting data that I'm not going to go into here, but if you want to learn more about it, it's in the articles that were referenced earlier. And then, of course, the key support person for those individuals as well. And the screening and inclusion criteria is basically they identify as having an intellectual disability using the AAIDD definition for disability, which is commonly accepted in the US and also often outside of the US, and also that they be social entrepreneurs. So they have a business that has a social mission that is central to the business itself, and that it's a business that wants to, make profit and grow and all that stuff. And then we used an index coding approach and thematic analysis. All right, so let's look at some of our findings, right? And we've got three sub-questions that we're looking at: that motivation, the management, and those outcomes. So when we're looking at motivation or why they act, we start by looking at the push-pull factors. And Maija sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'll go into a little more depth. So when we're talking about push factors, it's the idea that people with intellectual disabilities are being pushed into entrepreneurship due to a lack of other available options. This is sometimes referred to as necessity-based entrepreneurship. Whereas with pull factors, it's the idea that someone's being pulled into entrepreneurship because of an interest, a passion, it's something, a skill, it's something that they really want to do. And that's usually referred to as opportunity-based entrepreneurship. Interestingly enough, and we've published on this as well, is that this aligns with the policy that we see in disability employment and entrepreneurship policy as well. Entrepreneurship policy is almost entirely opportunity-based policies, whereas disability employment policy is overwhelmingly, well, not even disability employment, all of disability policy is overwhelmingly necessity-based policy. We are not providing opportunity-based policy that would benefit disability entrepreneurship in the disability space. When in fact, we can unequivocally say in the US, we don't have any entrepreneurship policy. We only have self-employment policy. And I can go off on that and have a whole conversation about that. And we've made recommendations to policymakers for ways we can change that. So hopefully we'll see some of those changes in the coming years. But so when you look at entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities, just like everybody else, it's a combination of both push and pull factors. We see this among entrepreneurs with disabilities in general and also entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities. However, one thing that was clear is while these entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities acknowledged that there were push factors, they ascribed more value to the pull factors in terms of pursuing their entrepreneurship. I think it's also important to mention the role of the social mission in the business and some of the discrepancies that we saw between the entrepreneurs themselves and their key support person. Right, and I said those similarities and discrepancies become really important. This is how, and if by doing dyadic interviewing, that it allows us to actually look at that data. So for the entrepreneurs with the disability, I see there's something in the chat. Is it a question?
So it says, that's an interesting point. I interviewed 2 people with cerebral palsy among a sample of 17 pan disability participants. Whilst they had very different levels of communication, one of which is hard to transcribe, they were also very articulate. I have managed the rigor by doing member checking, but in reality, the reason why this attitude exists is because there has been limited research in this area. And that is from Gregory.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a huge lack of methods for doing research with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and cerebral palsy would fall under that as a developmental disability. Autism also would fall under that, right? And so there's a severe lack of methodological development in that area. I could go off on that, but yeah, it's something where we do specifically need better ways to conduct that research in a participatory approach. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so when we look at the role of the social mission, there were a lot of discrepancies In particular, for the entrepreneurs, the social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities, the social mission of their business was that central social mission that we typically see, right, among social entrepreneurs, right? One of them was perhaps a fair trade coffee business or organic coffee business, things like that. However, for the key support persons, they sometimes saw a different social mission. They saw just that business employing the person with a disability as the social mission of the business, not the actual social mission that the entrepreneurs saw for the business. And so there was a discrepancy there, and that can actually limit the type of support that the social entrepreneur with intellectual disability is getting, because they're just getting, a support to be employed, not to actually, make sure that they've got a good, solid social mission that's central to their business. Does that make sense? And this happened with pretty much all of the key support persons, except for one, and that was a parent who was a business partner with her daughter, and I think because of that difference, and also the emphasis that she placed on self-determination for her daughter, she made very clear that they had their different roles in the business and they ran their sides of the business, right? But there were a lot of discrepancies when it came to what exactly is the social mission. And one thing that came up in looking at this is that these businesses had a direct social mission, right? That's the one that we're used to seeing. It's that central social mission, in that central to how the business is run itself. But they also tended to have an indirect mission. And this is another social mission they had on the side that was really important to them and typically related to their disability, even when their direct social mission did not. So for example, there was one participant who had a jewelry making business, right? And so the whole jewelry making business was about, she made jewelry and there was a little charm on each piece of jewelry with a puppy paw on it. And the idea is that all of the proceeds would go towards a service animal organization in her community that she worked with and that really needed more funding, right? And so for her, that was really important. But she also had a side business doing self-advocacy, motivational speaking, right? And part of the reason why is because she wanted people to see that they could do it as well. And so sometimes, we saw that there was this direct mission that may or may not be related to disability, but there was always an indirect social mission that typically was related to their experience with disability. For example, some of these individuals wanted to employ other people with disabilities. And so they really wanted their business to grow and be profitable so they could employ others, right? Or to show them that they too could have a business or to help them start businesses. And I think it's really important to talk, especially when we look at policy and best practices, about the different ways that support influences motivation. And in particular, that there can be a conflation of motivations whereby the key support person often conflates their motivation for why they want the person they're supporting to be a social entrepreneur or self-employed with the actual reason why the person with ID is doing it. And that can create a significant conflict of interest that limits and constrains the type of support that's being provided and also colors the type of conversations that are being had. For example, if they think the social mission is just about a disabled person having a job, then they're not going to actually have discussions around the actual social mission of the business itself and ways to improve and grow that. And we're going to sort of come back to some of these issues as we go. So let's look at management or how they act. A lot of things showed up here, basically in looking at the supportive relationships and how it plays out. One of the things that we found when looking at those main barriers and facilitators is that we found we found the same barriers that we see among entrepreneurs with disabilities in general. And we published an article on those main barriers that can be found on our SEED website if you want to learn about them in more depth. But the ones we saw here, and also there's tables for all of these barriers and also motivations and outcomes in the articles linked to earlier if you want more information or to see examples. But the main barriers we saw here were financial and economic. In particular, there was a significant lack of financial literacy because at no point did they ever have any opportunity to learn how to run a business. And a lot of times they had educational disadvantages. And one of the things that you see with people with intellectual disabilities is often they don't have the best money management skills. Now, this is kind of sort of a catch-22 situation because a lot of opportunities for these entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities get sort of cut off because it's believed, well, they won't be able to manage money. Like, how are they going to do that? They're not good at math. But I think we can acknowledge that there's a lot of CEOs out there who are not great with money. That's why they hire CFOs. That's why they hire accountants, right? So supports can actually be provided in ways to address these as accommodations, right? We also see a traditional expectations barrier. And Maija spoke to this a little bit earlier, but this basically speaks to the fact that the intellectual disability community is plagued by low expectations. And over time, that becomes internalized. It becomes internalized ableism. And so they start to sometimes question whether they can do it, as well as everybody else questioning whether they can do it. And it gets to this idea of dignity of risk. They don't even necessarily get the opportunity to try, even though we know by looking historically at some of the research that when disability entrepreneurship and self-employment are supported, it actually has a 65% success rate. So that's actually not bad. That's actually pretty good. And yet a lot of people are dissuaded from trying because of concerns that they won't be able to do it, right? We also see barriers in readiness and growth because they don't have access to business education or a lot of times small business development services or things like that traditionally an entrepreneur would turn to. Or even if they do try to utilize those services, they're not accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. Even things such as applying for business licensing and certification, we find that they're being turned away or they're being told that they're not allowed accommodations in taking the tests. Right? So we had some entrepreneurs that because they were working with food items needed to take sanitation licensing exams, courses and exams. And technically under the law, they should be allowed to have accommodations in those programs and in taking those tests. But because they didn't have intellectually disabled people getting food licensing and sanitation, certification, they didn't even know that it needed to be accessible to people with disabilities. And so what ended up happening is the entrepreneur had to bring in a lawyer, right, in order to make that happen. And where they ended up turning was to their local protection and advocacy organization. And this is a nationwide network of pro bono legal services for disabled people. There's one protection and advocacy organization in each state. And so they relied upon that pro bono service. And we're going to get to that in a moment. How that free help can help sometimes, but also hurt. So there's a lot of systemic reasons why we see this lack of readiness and growth. In particular, when it comes to growth, one of the biggest problems is that entrepreneurs with disabilities overall, as well as those with intellectual disabilities, often limit the growth and success of their business because they are scared of losing their benefits or public assistance if they make too much money. So they stop their business, they stop its growth and they stop its success. When it is successful, they stop it at a specific point so that it will not compromise their benefits. And we'll get to that more when we get to outcomes. All right, so we see systemic barriers, for example, the benefit system in the United States, and the different ways that is very disadvantaging. Also, transportation and healthcare also feed into these systemic barriers. And then, of course, we have some support barriers. I'm going to sort of glance over how the business is organized because I want to focus on these informal and formal support systems of support. So pretty much all of the support persons were in some way providing formal support to the social entrepreneur with intellectual disability. They may have been hired as a job coach through vocational rehabilitation. They may be providing personal assistance services to a family member, or they may actually be hired as an employee or be working as a business partner in the business. So they have some formal role. However, a lot of these businesses also had an over-reliance upon informal systems of support that were free, volunteer, or pro bono, right? And one thing that we saw very clearly is that entrepreneurs with disabilities overall, but including entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities, operate outside of the service system, right? So technically they should be able to benefit from both the vocational rehabilitation system that provides employment services to people with disabilities in each state, and also the business service system. For example, the small business development centers and the SBA, things like that. However, entrepreneurs with disabilities find that their needs are not being adequately met by either service system. And so they operate outside of them because the disability service system does not know how to start a business. They're not good at it. They do not have any competency in small business development, right? They get very confused. If you ask a VR case counselor how you start a business, they'll be like, well, here's a form and we'll check in with you in a year. but also the business service system doesn't know, or in many cases feel they don't have to or don't need to work with disabled people, oftentimes turning them away. Oftentimes the services, trainings, etc. that they provide are not accessible. And so because they're not actually being fully served by either system, they tend to operate outside of it entirely. And that leads to a reliance on informal support systems such as family, friends, and pro bono services. And that can be pro bono legal services, pro bono accounting, pro bono marketing. It's really whatever they can get for free. Now, one thing that our research has found is that this is actually really, really essential, these informal supports in starting their business. And it's really helpful in their starting their business. However, when they get to the point where their business needs to grow and needs to start generating a profit, it actually can become more harmful than it is helpful. Because if they continue relying upon those informal supports and never formalizing what is going to then become an essential business need for them, then it's never going to really get to the point where it's seen as a quote unquote real business. It runs the risk of continuing to be seen as a quote unquote hobby rather than a real business, right? But also that's where you might see a, I'm using a lot of air quotes today, failure to launch, right? Where their business doesn't really get off the ground because they're not thinking about, okay, right now I've been relying upon my mom's best friend for my marketing or my accounting, or I'm relying upon my benefits advisor for my accounting, that is not what they do, and they don't know how to do it, right? So how do I make enough profit so that I can hire an employee who is then going to fill that service that I'm going to need as my business grows? They're not thinking like that because that's not an actual possibility for them. And I think this sort of takes us to our next category, which is looking at the outcomes. What happens when they act? In particular, when you ask them, oh, sorry, someone saying something?
This is Maija. I was just saying we have 15 minutes to go. So I think if you can wrap up and then we can make sure there's time for questions in the end. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's fine. This is my last part. And then I was going to have questions. All right, so this works well. All right, so when you think about what they want to accomplish 1 year or 5 years down the road, they had a lot of difficulty thinking 5 years down the road, and we're really sort of looking at just year to year. What do they want to accomplish? But here we also saw a lot of discrepancies between the key support person and the entrepreneur with intellectual disability, yet again, particularly around the themes of profit versus self-sufficiency, growth, and innovation and idea generation. So when it comes to profit, all but one of the key support persons, and you might have guessed it, that one person is the one who was a business partner with her daughter. All of the other key support persons felt that their entrepreneur with a disability didn't know what profit meant, that profit wasn't important to them, that they didn't understand money or profit. They never talked to them about profit or the social mission or the mission of the business because they didn't think it was something that they would understand. So they didn't even have those conversations. However, and really the goal for those key support persons was financial self-sufficiency, which is, more of a self-employment driver than it is an entrepreneurship driver, right? So they just want them to have a job that can help support themselves, that one, over time. So it doesn't matter necessarily that they make a profit or that the business grow. However, every social entrepreneur with intellectual disability that we spoke with very clearly had an understanding of what profit meant to them. And it might not be a textbook answer or profit, but it was at its very core what profit is intended to do. So for them, profit meant that if their business makes enough money, they'll be able to have the quality of life that they want. They'll be able to do the things that they want, live the way that they want to live. Like maybe they want to move into their own apartment and not live at home with their parents, right? Maybe they want to have be able to afford a vacation, right? And not just have to rely upon their families to take trips. They want to be more independent, right? And so in many different ways, they all describe how their business, and more importantly, how their business making a profit will allow them to continue doing the work that they are passionate about. At the end of the day, that's what profit meant to them. Yet for all but one of the key support persons, they just left it at, they don't understand what profit is without necessarily even having that conversation. And that's going to put some significant limitations on the type of support that's being provided. Also, when we look at growth, there were some huge discrepancies between the key support person and the entrepreneurs themselves. However, I think also you saw the entrepreneurs put limitations on their own growth because they want to grow. They want to, be a boss and hire employees. And there was one in particular that really wants to work in an office, manage people, and tell them what to do. Like that was his dream. He wanted to answer phones. Like he was really, really into it. But when you ask them, how they see a path for themselves getting there, it's really unclear because they don't know how they're going to actually be able to be reliant upon public benefits and caught in this benefits poverty trap that we have here in the US and actually make enough money to bridge that gap to becoming not just financially self-sufficient as individuals, but for their business to become self-sustaining enough to actually begin hiring employees. Right? So they know that they need to and want to hire employees, but it doesn't seem realistic. And one of the things that we need to do in policy is actually create pathways and incentives for entrepreneurs with disabilities to hire that first employee. And also for these to not be means tested, right? So for such business expenses not to count against their savings or savings disincentives, asset limitations, earned income, all of these things that would then jeopardize their public benefits. So growth is significantly being constrained by the benefits system. And then let's finish off with innovation and idea generation. A lot of these social entrepreneurs, actually all of these social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities, they got the idea for their business by an unmet need that they saw in their lives, or a problem that they saw in their lives that they wanted to solve. So something that came very much from their own experience that led them to want to create a business to address that, because that's the best way they could think to do it, and because they were passionate about it. However, for all of the key support persons, that was not what they saw as being innovative about the business. They thought that the innovative nature of this social enterprise was simply the fact that an intellectually disabled person owned a business. I just want to be clear that that is not that's not necessarily the innovative part of these businesses. And the idea that a company, that a social enterprise employs people with intellectual disabilities is not innovative, and not at all. It's actually the oldest form of social enterprise, going all the way back. I mean, a lot of people hold up Goodwill Industries as an example of a good social enterprise. However, when you look at what it's done to the disability community, it is exploitative and oppressive. because Goodwill Industries International is actually the largest provider of sheltered workshops, paying people with disabilities sub-minimum wage, if anything at all, and that it's actually keeping people impoverished, and it does not allow them employment opportunities. And so we actually have this huge discrepancy between what actually is a good social enterprise in the disability sector. So when we're talking about, a social entrepreneur with a disability running the business themselves, there is an aspect of, newness there, but it's not necessarily what made their businesses innovative necessarily. What made their businesses innovative was the different ways that they were working within systems that structurally disadvantaged them at every turn. It was the product or service that their business was providing to their communities to try and meet those needs. And that's what we see in social entrepreneurship in general, right? And we see the same thing among social entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities. But a lot of times we let their disability get in the way of us actually seeing them as business persons. And that comes back to those attitudinal barriers that we often see entrepreneurs with intellectual disabilities facing. And I'm just going to sort of leave it there. Yeah. All right, so thank you so much. Do you guys have any questions?